Hey class, in this lab we're going to be adding scenery into a Godot game. We're going to start by drawing some scenic elements. You can choose at least 3, but you can feel free to do more if you want to. And these elements should communicate something about the world that our game takes place in. I'm going to do my demo in Piskel, but you could also use another art editor if you want to. And try some variations, try out some different versions of the different elements before you choose the final versions to add into the game. Once we have our art, we'll go look at putting it into a Godot project. So we'll set up a quick Godot project. You can use the artist default or a game that you're working on. And then we're just going to add in our scenery as sprites. And we'll also look at using a Parallax Background setup for some of the scenery. Once we do that, we'll do some documentation and post it on the Open Lab, and that'll be it. So let's get started. So we're going to get started in Piskel, and I'm going to save this file. So I always want to save my Piskel file so I can come back and edit this later. And I'm going to put scenery at the beginning just to organize my files when I put my sprites into my project later. So I'll call this scenery_clouds. And let's create a scenery folder in our artist folder real quick just to put this in there. And now we're ready to get started. So I'm just going to make a couple of generic scenic elements for my game, starting with some clouds. And I'm going to keep things pretty simple. I'm going to try a few different things with like texturing and stuff like that, but I'm not going to be spending a ton of time here just for the sake of the demo. You should spend a little bit more time thinking about what can you make that's unique to your game. Clouds are pretty generic, so you might want to come up with something that suggests something more specific about what's happening in your game. So I'm just going to use these as kind of an example. So I'll be using clouds and trees just as these kind of like default examples that we see in a lot of games. So I want to add some shading in here, and with a cloud, we want to add some highlights at the top of the cloud and then some darker colors at the bottom of the cloud. So at the bottom of the cloud, that's the part that's actually not being hit by the sun. So it's going to be a little bit darker. So we put some dark shading down there, and the highlights are the parts that are getting hit by the sun. So we'll put some brighter colors up there. And once I've got a basic idea of what I want, I'm going to create 3 different versions of this cloud, and I'm just going to put them in each frame, and I'll export it as a sprite sheet. That way it'll be easy to organize because I'll just have one file that I'll have to import into Godot. But using the sprite in Godot, I can choose different frames from the file. So that way I can have a file with 3 clouds, but I can separate the clouds into separate sprites in my game. So once I'm happy with 3 clouds, I'm going to save it. And I'm going to export my PNG sprite sheet. So I'll go to the Export tab and click on PNG, and then click Download. And I'm exporting it at its default size, 32 by 32 pixels. I can always size that up in the Godot editor if I want to. The nice thing with pixel art is that I don't have to worry about sizing the art up or down because it retains the hard edges. So I'll just leave that as is. So now we're going to move on to some trees. These I'm going to be using for the background, so I'm going to make them a little larger. And you can see my design process here. I wasn't super happy with the first few attempts that I did, but I'll leave them in here and just speed them up so you can see that I did go through a few rounds of this process. And normally I like to kind of keep these things short because I'm just doing a demo, but I wasn't super happy with what I was getting, so I tried a few different versions. And in the end, I got something that I was okay with, but I had to kind of move on. Hopefully you can spend a little bit more time on this and get something that you really like. So here's a sped up version of my first 3 attempts. It's only about a minute long, but feel free to skip to the next chapter. So here's the final version of the trees that I made. This time, one thing that helped was starting out with some guides. So instead of just starting out from scratch, I made a rectangle for the trunk of the tree and then just a circle for where I would want to draw the branches and leaves. And so that way I had something to start with structurally as I started drawing, so I didn't have to worry about drawing in the texture and colors and the shape at the same time. So that helped out a little bit. So I'm gonna just choose a brown here for the trunk of the tree and then outline the rectangle using the pencil and doing it kind of scratchy and then filling it in. So then I chose a green color for the leaves and then traced the outside of the circle kind of roughly and then filled that in as well. So once I was happy with the basic shape and the colors, I got my lighten and darken tool and used both of those to add in some details and some shading. Even though this is a pretty small palette, I did have a lot more detail in these than I did in some of my other drawings. And I think that's one thing that kind of made it hard with this process, is that I was making these other drawings that had kind of more simplified pixel style, and this one felt like a lot more detail to work with. So that was kind of a different change. So then I made a new frame and I just created a new tree, kind of tracing the first tree and just making some slight differences in the branches, but using the first tree as kind of a model. And I just repeated that process with my second tree. Just in the next frame, just like the clouds, I can add in these trees on different frames and then create a sprite sheet and then choose the different frames in Godot. So I just did 3 clouds and 3 trees just as an example. Depending on the style that you're going for, you might want to actually add more or fewer. You might just repeat the same cloud over and over again if you're going for that retro game style. If you want more variety in terms of the colors and shapes and things going on in your scene, then I would recommend probably doing more than 3. You can still repeat them in Godot and create as many copies as you want, but having more drawings will of course add to that variety. So once I got the 3 trees that I liked, I save the file and then export a PNG sprite sheet. So the last element of scenery that I made was a little sign that says, beware of the snakes or watch out for snakes. And I wanted to add something in the scene that wasn't going to be just a visual part of the scenery. Scenery does have a role other than just creating the setting of the game. Sometimes it can also be used to give information about the game or tell the player where to go or do other things like that. And so this is a really basic example. It's not subtle and it's meant to be that way. I just want to make something that is very clearly signaling to the player what to expect in the game. And so an easy way to do that is just tell the player, beware the snakes or watch out for snakes, because that's the main obstacle in the game that I'm designing. And so that tells the player right from the beginning what to look out for. Any drawings or sprites or art that we put in our game that aren't interactive are part of our scenery. And so that doesn't just mean things like grass and trees and mountains in the background. It also means components of our game that convey information to the player that's necessary to understand the world that they're in. So for the sign, I just made something really simple. I made kind of like a wooden sign. So I made a little guide with a square for the sign and a little pole for the sign to sit on. And then I traced that with a brown color for the kind of wood that I'm imagining this sign would be made out of. And then I filled that in. Again, I used my lighten and darken tool to add a little bit of shading just to make it look more like real wood. And then I just drew the text onto the sign. So you can add text using a font, and I go over how to do that in one of the UI design labs under the designer tier. So if you wanted to do that, you could go check out that lab and learn how to add your own font and add text into the scene as well. But for this one, I'm just going to draw on here just to kind of keep things simple. So I'm going to draw a little message, watch out for snakes, and play around with that. So this message obviously is not super readable, but for the purposes of the demo, I think it's fine. It's clear enough what's happening here. So I'm just going to stick with this. So once I'm happy with that, I'm going to save this PNG as well and save that into my scenery folder with my other scenery elements. And once I have those, I can put them in a little zip archive if I want to share them with another student. And so now that I have my scenery set up, I'm going to go to my Godot project and add those in there. So you probably already have a project started if you've done the character animation or some of the other labs, and you can just start from there. But if you don't have the project or you want to start with something fresh, you can download the artist default folder, and you can see I've already got that in there. So I'm just going to start working with that. You can see I have my sprites from some of my other labs in there. So since I already have that, what I'm going to do is just go ahead and throw the sprites that I just created into that sprite folder and just keep working with that project. You could also add that to a game project that you might be working on. If you're not sure what the best way to set it up is, let me know and we can go over it. So then I'll open up my project.godot and I'm going to open up my default scene. And so in this default scene, I've just got some platforms and I've got a player. And that's a good place to get started. We can just throw in some scenery and we'll look at a few different ways to do this. So creating the art is part of the project, but we also need to know how to put our art into the scene. Let's go over how to set this up. So let's make a new node 2D that's going to contain our scenery. I'll click on my default scene and click the plus and add in a node 2D. And I'm just going to rename that scenery and drag it up in the hierarchy. So it's going to be behind our platforms and behind our player. And we might want to play around with that a little bit. With the scenery, you might want to have some stuff in the background, some stuff in the foreground. So we'll look at how we can do that outside of just dragging things around in the scene. So I'm just going to start with my warning sign. I'm just going to start with something simple. So I'm going to create a new sprite inside the scenery node and call that warning sign. And then I'm going to go to my texture and grab that and put it in there. And so when it first shows up in the scene, it's behind the player, we can't see it, and we're going to want to move that. And it's kind of hard to drag because there's actually a bunch of stuff that is all at 0, 0 in the middle of the scene. And so that's a good opportunity to use the lock and deselect icons in our toolbar. So I'm just going to do that with my player and my platforms so that I don't click on those when I'm trying to select my new scenic element. And so once I've got that set up, I can grab warning sign and just drag it down here onto the platform. And then if I want to make a copy, it's probably not necessary, but maybe my player will go to the right, maybe they'll go to the left. I can just drag a copy over and put it on the other side of this platform. So now I've got a couple of signs, and these signs can just kind of stay where they are because they're part of the scene that the player is in. We can see that they're like visually on top of the platforms. And so it makes sense that they move at the same rate that the player moves across the platform. So we can see our player moves back and forth and the signs move with the player and the player camera. Some of our other scenery, however, we're going to want to move differently. And so we can start adding in our clouds. And so I'm going to create another node 2D inside of my scenery node. I like to keep things organized. So if I'm going to have more than one or two of something, I'm going to create a node for it. This will save me a lot of time in the long run as far as finding things and organizing my scene and not having just a huge big list of stuff that makes it hard to find things. So inside of my clouds node, I'm going to add a new sprite and add a texture, and I'm going to choose my clouds. And so remember, our clouds are a PNG sprite sheet. And so there's 3 of them in that sprite sheet. So when we first open it up, we see all 3 clouds. And that's obviously not what we want, so we can fix that. So what we need to do is grab the sprite and open the animation section. We're not actually animating the sprite, but this is where we'll find the horizontal frames and vertical frames. You may remember that from setting up the character animation in the character animation lab. And so we're just going to change those values. So I'm going to change H frames to 2 because there's 2 horizontal frames, and V frames to 2 as well. And then there's also a frame property, which is the number frame that we're on. So our first cloud will just be 0. And then I'm just going to duplicate that cloud and get another one. And all I have to do is update the number of the frame to see different art. So there's our second frame. And then for our third cloud, we can just duplicate this again. And now we have 3 clouds. Notice that the index actually starts counting at 0. So the first frame is 0. So even though we have 3 clouds, the third cloud is the number 2 index. So that can be a little confusing if you haven't seen that before, but that's generally what we do in programming and game design is we start counting at 0. So another thing that we might want to do is make sure that our clouds are behind our platforms. And we also want to have our signs in front of our platform. So how do we do that? Well, we can use the Z index. And I can set the Z index on the individual clouds, or I can set it on the whole cloud scene, which is a little bit easier. I can just set it once and not have to set it for each individual one. So now our clouds will be behind the platforms, but our signs can stay in front. So that's how I can move things back and forth in the scene depth without changing their order in the hierarchy. So let's duplicate this little cluster of clouds and make a few more clouds. And then we can also duplicate the whole group itself and move that over here. So I can organize that in different ways. I could do a lot more variety. I'm just gonna kind of leave these the way they are because we can kind of get the point from this. And so when we play our scene, we can see that the clouds behave like everything else in the scene. They just move along with the player as the camera moves with the player. And that looks fine. You could leave it that way. But if you want something that has a little bit more depth to create a little bit more variety and sort of realism in the scene, we can use what's called a parallax background. And what that does is it moves at a different pace from the rest of the scene, which kind of changes the perception and makes it look like there's more depth in the scene, even though we're not working in 3D. So the way that I can do that is add a parallax background. And this is actually its own canvas layer. So right now we have this one main canvas layer where we're drawing all of our graphics. And we can also add multiple other canvas layers. And so those canvas layers will not be affected by the main camera in our scene. And so with our parallax background, we can add parallax layers, and then the layers can be positioned in different places and have different depth and also move at different speeds. So that's the kind of cool thing about the parallax layer. So let's put our clouds in there, and then we can try a couple things. So if we go into the parallax layer and we open up this motion property, you can see that there's motion for X and Y, and the default is 1 and 1 on X and Y. And if we leave it like that, you can see the clouds still move in the normal way. But if we want to change the speed that the clouds move, we can change that scale of motion. And so what I'll do is just change X to 0.5, and let's try Y at 0.1. So they'll move half as quickly on the X-axis horizontally, and a tenth or 10% as quickly on the Y-axis. So we have to use the kind of percentage here or fractions relative to how fast or how much the character is moving. And so now you can see we get that cool depth effect that you've probably seen in games before or animations where the clouds are moving at a different rate, and so they appear to be farther in the background. So then the next thing that we can do with our parallax layer that's pretty useful is we can add mirroring, so we can repeat what happens in the background. So that way we don't have to duplicate our clouds a million times to try to fill up the game window. And what we can do is change the mirroring. And so we'll just do mirroring on the X for this demo. You can do it on Y as well, but it's a little easier if we just do on the X. And we don't really need clouds going like below where the player is. So let's just mirror on X, and we'll set the mirroring to 1024, which is the width of our game window. So that way we can create this pattern that repeats once we get through one sort of length of our game window. Actually, let's quickly add in another set of platforms so we can actually move our player far enough to see how this works. So let's just duplicate our tile map and just move it over. Okay, so now we have enough room. And so that looks pretty good. It's a little bit offset. You can see that we get to this point where the clouds sort of disappear suddenly. And that's because our camera is actually centered on the player. And so we just need to offset this parallax layer by half of the width of the scene. So we can do that by just choosing the offset on X and doing half of 1024, which is 512. And now that looks better. So you might have to play around with that to get it exactly right. Sometimes I think I've got it right and it looks kind of weird. And so you might need to kind of move things back and forth. But generally, you just want your clouds in the first sort of 1024 pixels or one width of the screen. And so you might need to play around with that to make sure it's working correctly, but you should be able to do that. So now let's move on to our trees. And what I'm going to do is just duplicate the parallax layer that I created for the clouds. This has a bunch of stuff already set up. So rather than redo all of that stuff, I'm just going to duplicate it, and then I'll delete the clouds and add in my trees. I can change the parameters here if I want to change the motion and stuff like that, but this will get me kind of started. So once I've got my parallax layer, I'm going to add in a node 2D and call this tree. So again, I want to organize stuff. If I'm going to add in a lot of trees, I want to be able to duplicate those trees and not have like a big crazy mess. So I'm going to create a trees node and then add in a sprite. And then we'll follow the same process here Once I import my sprite sheet, you can see that I've got 3 trees. And so I need to change the H frames and V frames to 2 each. And then I also want to make the trees a little bit bigger. So I'm going to scale these up. And since we're using pixel art, it looks fine. And then after that, I also want to make sure the trees are behind the clouds. I'm not really sure why, it just kind of feels like the trees should be behind the clouds. So I could change the Z index here, but I can also just drag and drop. And since it's in the same layer, that's a little bit easier. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So let's rename these layers. Since they're both called Parallax Layer, to make things a little bit clearer, we want to name them. So we can have clouds and we can have trees. And so I'll keep working on my tree. So I want to keep it basically starting in this range because I'm going to do the same thing where we can see it's already got the mirroring set up. And one thing I want to just test real quick is make sure the tree doesn't kind of clip in and out of the frame. And you can see it does that little kind of clipping thing. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. It might not be noticeable if you have like a ton of stuff in your scene, but since we only have a few elements, it's pretty noticeable when the tree clips in like that. So I moved the tree back a little bit into the scene to make sure that it's inside of our game window that's being mirrored. And now I don't see that clipping. So I'm not 100% sure why this worked and the previous version didn't. But if you see that, you may need to just move the tree around until you get it the way that you want it and it doesn't clip. So let's move these trees down a bit, and then I'm going to duplicate this and change the frame number to get our second tree. And then I'll duplicate it again and change the frame number again. And so now we have our 3 trees, and that's pretty good. I'm going to change the motion a bit. So you can see the trees and the clouds are kind of moving at different rates, and it's actually a little jarring. I think I did a bit too much on that. So now I want to fill in my trees a little bit. Instead of duplicating the trees inside my current layer, I'm just going to make a whole new layer. And so I'll make a new layer and I'll move the sprites in here around a bit to kind of offset them from the original pattern. And so I'll kind of fill some stuff in here, and that looks pretty good. So then I'm going to duplicate this again and make 3 more trees and move those around. And I think this should probably be enough to kind of fill things in. You don't necessarily have to have something that looks like this where everything is filled in, but I kind of thought that would be a good thing to go for. And so we'll see how this looks. And then I'm just going to change the speed just a little bit. So I'll make one of them 0.525 and the other 0.475. So I'm just deviating 0.25 in either direction from the original trees, which are 0.5 on the X. And so now you can see it's very subtle, but the trees are moving at different speeds. And that again adds to this kind of sense of depth that's happening there. And so that looks pretty good. I could definitely spend a lot more time tweaking this and kind of moving things around and making things look exactly how I want them to. But I'm pretty happy with this as a demo. So let's do some documentation. And they kind of look the same, but I just want to get a couple different looks so you can see that the scene is changing as I move through it. And so once I've got those screenshots, I'm going to go over to the Open Lab as usual. And I'll create a new post and I'll find my categories. I'm just going to search for scenery and then put in my scenery. And we want to make sure to add both our sprites and our screenshots in here. So we can describe the scenery that we created, and we can talk a little bit about what we were kind of thinking of as the setting for the game. And so if we want to collaborate or share this with another project, you might want to talk first about what you want to work on and what should be in the scene. Or if you've just created some scenery that you think would look cool in a game and other people might want to use it, that's fine as well. So first I tried adding a gallery, but I had some issues with formatting. So after that, I just added in my screenshots. So I'm going to add in the screenshots, and then I went back and just added in my sprites by themselves. So you might want to try playing around with the gallery. I couldn't get the settings to look the way that I wanted them to, I think because the images are too small. So I can just drag in those sprites and give them a little label. And let's give that a preview. And that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and publish.